Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. Let's talk gardening. This is just something I'd like to do any day to anybody, but with you all today, let's make it extra special. Shout out to Sunset Gazing for sharing a couple Gardener Scout memberships. I appreciate that. Always nice to see that support, and definitely want to say hello to Rick in Sydney, where it's 36 Celsius. That's 97 degrees Fahrenheit. Many of us here in the States are past that point, but it just goes to show whichever end of the season you're on, it's going to be hot somewhere. And I want to talk today about the seasons, whether we're ending the season or beginning our season. It's always good to talk to other gardeners, to share what we're going through and what we've already experienced. And I think that makes all of us better gardeners. So that's going to be the focus of today's show. I'll be sharing some of the things that happened in my garden this year, and I look forward to hearing some of the things that you've shared. And then moving forward, especially for people like Rick in Australia who are just beginning their gardening season, maybe it'll give you some ideas of how you can proceed. So always nice to have everybody here today. Temperatures are just crazy. John C. is saying hello from the UK, where it's 24 Celsius. That's about 76 Fahrenheit. That's pretty close to what my temperatures have been in recent weeks. But I'm definitely on the beginning of a cool down cycle. I think October is here. It's one of those things that happens every year. We've had freezes here in my part of Colorado by this time in the past. So it's been warmer than normal, but the cold days are coming. It's possible that we might get some frost next week. Keep your fingers crossed. And Boothby Gardens is at 28 C, which is 83 degrees Fahrenheit. So nice to hear your reporting of what's going on. And this is one of those things, I think it's one of those things, as simple as the temperatures that we've experienced in our gardens. Yesterday, I had lunch with my gardener buddy, Jason. And for a couple hours, all we did was talk gardening. That's what we do when we get together. But we talked a lot about temperatures and the weather and how that affected our gardens. And by talking about those kind of things, especially when it was extra hot or extra rainy, as I encountered this year, when you can talk to local gardeners in particular, you can share those ideas about what happened and what you did. And so Jason has a greenhouse, I have a greenhouse, and the heat this year really affected his greenhouse. His is bigger than mine. If you've seen my videos, I've got doors on both ends of my greenhouse. And so I open up both of those doors to get ventilation to keep the temperature down. In Jason's greenhouse, it's a different type of greenhouse. It isn't anchored the same way mine is. And the doors open, much bigger doors, creates a big wind tunnel, and it poses some problems for him in what he's growing. So he often closes one of the doors. Well, that closing of the door increases the heat, and so his gardening in the greenhouse was not as successful this year because we had the winds that tied into the heat. And by talking about those things, I was able to recognize that what I was doing worked for me because I was able to bring the temperature down. And moving into the future, I'm going to be adding even more ventilation for those days when I need to close the door, but I can still have the fans going. So I know many of you don't have greenhouses, but it's to point out that by sharing our experiences with someone else who has some of the similar garden beds, similar flowers, similar methods of gardening, we can often learn something, or at least substantiate some of the things that we've encountered in the last year. So that's one of those things we're going to be working on. Rick's wondering, how's the weather station doing? So it's great. I actually have 2 weather stations now, and it's one of those things. Eli from In the Garden with Eli and Kate Channel and I talk about the geeky factor of the weather in our respective gardens, and she does a lot more of the documenting of the weather in her garden. I look at it more short term, but it's great because I can look at what's happening in my garden. I can look at the trends in my garden. So by having weather stations, you can collect that data and you can see what's actually happening where your plants are growing. The National Weather Service is great at keeping the records from day to day, month to month, year to year, and that meteorological data is important as we look at the larger trends. But my nearest weather station is many miles away, and my garden's temperature is different than the official reading. And the amount of rain I get, the amount of wind I get, it is different than what others think is happening by watching the news or reading the newspaper. So I love my weather stations because I can get a very accurate reading of what's happening in my garden. So for instance, next Saturday, the forecast is calling for 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that equates to a little over 3 degrees Celsius. That's the forecast. Well, I've recognized that in my garden, I have a 2 to 3 degree Fahrenheit variation from that forecast. So as I get closer, I'll be looking at my weather station data much more closely because it's possible, because of that variation that I've seen in my garden, I might get a frost on Saturday or Sunday. And so as we get closer and I look closer at the forecast, I may need to take action and cover my plants to get past this little cold spell. Cold spell. And so weather station's working great, Rick, because I can get the good numbers to put me in the best position, especially at this time of year when I need to protect my plants, which is one of those most important aspects, I think, of gardening in regions like I have in Colorado. Brian says, I've given up checking the weather and now just deal with what comes along. It's so variable. Yeah, and that's kind of the mode I was in. I always do look at the forecast. I encourage gardeners to be aware of the weather that's coming so that they can do things like get out and protect their plants. But the weather stations, especially the Tempest weather station that I have, it actually has AI built into it, and it's learning about the weather in my area. And so as it ties in with the network and gives its own forecasts, I'm learning that they're a little more accurate because I have that specific Tempest weather station in my garden. So it is one of those geeky things. And yeah, for thousands of years, farmers and gardeners have just looked to the skies and dealt with whatever the weather is bringing their way. I like to have a little bit more of a time frame to work on if I can see it coming a few days in advance, but whatever works best for you is definitely the way to go. Carla says the Pacific Northwest Weather Watch always talks about the Tempest weather station. Oh, okay. It's good. I really like it, and I think I've got a link in the description below. I'm pretty sure I've got a link to the Tempest. I have a couple videos where I've talked about it, and it's incredible. It really is amazingly accurate, and there's no moving parts. It's all electronic, and can't explain how it works, but it works pretty well. So Sherry's saying my original San Marzano, still out on the front steps in a big pot, is still producing both flowers and fruit. It doesn't know the season is supposed to be over. That's great. So I did a lot of that this week, knowing that the cooler conditions are coming. Once the the temperatures cool, particularly at night, the tomato plants will still set the flowers, they'll still set the fruit, but the fruit is either not going to ripen or ripen very, very slowly. And so this week I've been pinching off flowers. I've been topping my tomato plants, pinching off the growing tips that I hadn't got to before. And that's one of those activities that's kind of a normal part of my first days of autumn. But I'm still harvesting as well. My San Marzano is actually giving me some really good fruit. I harvested some yesterday. And you're right, it doesn't know that it's cool. This is one of those things we talked about, keeping track of the plants in your garden journal. This is one of those things to point out. And you know, we can say, yeah, my San Marzano doesn't know that it's cold. It's still giving me flowers and fruit. Well, that's a good thing to write down, especially if you live in an area that it gets cold quickly and most other plants aren't producing. If you notice, particularly a tomato or a pepper or one of those fruiting plants, if it continues to fruit in the cool days, for those of us who live in cool areas, those are the kind of plants you might want to grow again, because you've learned that the cold weather really doesn't matter. So go ahead and keep growing them. Glacier tomato is one that I've grown periodically over the years. It's called Glacier because it comes from cold regions and it doesn't mind the cold temperatures as the seasons change. So if you do have weather patterns that make your gardening challenging, start making particular note of the plants that do well during those changing weather conditions. And that can really help add to the enjoyment and the success as you move forward in the gardening journey that you're on. Thanks, Jay, for posting that. And I do have, with the Tempest, I believe, Gardner Scott is a code you can use, and I'm pretty sure that you can get a discount from Tempest. I don't remember what the discount is, but yeah, try using the Gardner Scott code if you're interested in getting the Tempest weather station. And like I said, I think there's a link in the description below. So always fun to have stuff like that. Heidi says, I grew Shelby paste determinate tomatoes this year. Really produced a lot. There are still lots of green tomatoes on the plants. I haven't grown Shelby and don't grow a lot of determinate tomatoes. But that's good to know. Thank you for giving us that report, Heidi. Always nice to hear how things are going in your garden. One of the things I really like doing, and this is why I want to encourage that you talk with other gardeners, particularly in your area if you can find them, is to get those ideas of the varieties that are doing well. That's one of the things that Jason and I talk about when we get together, is we share the varieties that we each are growing. And often we talk about the varieties that both of us are growing in the same variety. And so when you can find what works in your area, every garden's different. I can tell you all day long about the varieties I grow, but they might not do well in your garden. It's finding what does best in your garden, and chances are gardeners in your area have some of those tips and are growing some of those plants that do well for them. So you can ascertain that they're going to do well for you. And also some of the techniques. So one of the things that Jason has been working on this year as a new experiment is mulching with alfalfa. And so if you go to a ranch or farm supply store, they will sell bales of straw, bales of hay, and bales of alfalfa. And I love straw as a mulch, but there really isn't nutritional value in the straw. So I like straw because it does decompose and it does add organic matter to the soil. But what Jason has been doing is doing the same thing, but instead of straw, he's using alfalfa. And this is alfalfa that would normally be fed to horses and cows. And he loves it. And he's already noticed a difference because as the alfalfa breaks down, it's adding nutrients to the soil. Alfalfa is actually relatively high in nitrogen, and straw has no nitrogen. And so this is one of those things, after talking with him, I'm going to be doing that next year. And you'll probably see it in some of my videos that my mulch will be green instead of brown because I'll be using alfalfa instead of straw. By talking to other gardeners, you can get ideas that you may never thought about. I've talked about using alfalfa in the garden before, but that's more adding alfalfa to the compost pile because of the nitrogen component. I haven't really thought much about using the same material as a mulch in my vegetable garden beds. But now I do because I was sharing what I'm doing and Jason was sharing what he's doing, and it makes perfect sense for what's going on for both of us. So hello, Dennis. Good morning to you in Southeast Denver. Going to pick my green tomatoes today. Weather's getting ready to cool. And yeah, that's just up the road from me. I'm not at that point yet where I'm picking my green tomatoes, but I've been doing a lot of tomato picking this week and doing freeze drying. I've not only freeze drying my cherry tomatoes, but those delicious black crims that I love, I've been slicing them and putting them in my freeze dryer as well. So this is such a great time of year when you have so much that you got to try to figure out what you're going to do with it. And I just love my freeze dryer. It's really working out quite well. And Heidi's asking a good question. Are there a lot of seeds in alfalfa? So sometimes, but not as much as hay. I don't like using hay as a mulch because hay is a different, it's a grass that they're harvesting, and it almost always has seeds in it. But the alfalfa is typically harvested a little bit earlier. There might be seeds in it, but that's one of those things I'm going to have to find out. I no longer use hay because I've had to spend a whole season just weeding the garden from using the hay mulch. But from what I've been reading and what Jason was saying, the alfalfa really doesn't have the same problem with the seeds. So I'll let you know, and we'll see how it works in the future. And Gail saying used alfalfa pellets in the fall and spring. Yeah, that's definitely something that I've been enjoying as well as the alfalfa pellets, especially if you have rabbits, if you have the small animals that are eating the alfalfa pellets, and then you clean up the cages, and so you've got some rabbit droppings and some of the alfalfa pellets that have already broken apart. That's the great stuff to not only add to the compost pile, but you can sprinkle that on top of the soil, especially at the end of the season, and it'll help benefit. Check out the Two Gals Vermont Homestead with Gail channel because they just got a greenhouse, beautiful, beautiful greenhouse. And so really nice video as they're checking out the new greenhouse, and I look forward to seeing what you're gonna be doing in the greenhouse. But I enjoyed that video, and a beautiful greenhouse. I think it's just fantastic. That's another one of those things. So when I was finally in the market to get a greenhouse, I watched a lot of videos on greenhouses to try to choose which one I was going to put into my garden. And there were a lot of other factors involved. But when we share our gardens with other people, like the Two Gals in Vermont with Gail, they're sharing what they did and what it looks like now, and it's great and can give you wonderful ideas about greenhouses. If it's one of those things that you're like me a couple years ago in the mode of getting a greenhouse, check out some of the other gardeners and what they're doing, and my videos as well, because I have a completely different type of greenhouse. And when you start comparing what others are doing, greenhouses, plants, beds, mulches, it really does help you advance your planning so that when you're ready to act, when you're ready to do something like get a greenhouse, you've got some of the best information available because of other gardeners who are sharing what they're doing. So I think that's an important aspect of, not only should we seek out others who are sharing what they're doing, but I think it's great for you to share what you're doing with others, because you never know what that other person is looking for, and you never know what that other person needs to hear, and you could be the one to share the information. So always good for gardeners to talk to each other. Hello, Rudimental Gardening. Growing rutabagas from seed in my fall garden this year. Awesome. This is the first time for growing these root vegetables. I don't think I've ever eaten them before. So it's been a few years since I've grown rutabagas. I grew them at the Galileo garden, and it's a fun plant to grow, especially at harvest time. And I liked growing rutabagas and turnips and parsnips and carrots, and taking all of those root vegetables and then having them in the same dish. Roasted root vegetables. Oh, it's just so fantastic, especially as a holiday dish. So it's not a bad flavor. You know, I don't really think any of those root vegetables have a bad flavor. It's a little more unique than you might be used to, but there's people all over the world eating rutabagas. So good for you. I hope you have a great rutabaga crop. But think about roasting them. I think they taste better roasted, especially when you can mix them with some of those other root vegetables. That's always a good way to do it. And Socks in the Garden is saying, I'm growing parsnips and turnips for the first time. Awesome. Same thing. The turnips, I'd actually like making mashed potatoes with the turnips in them. So I'll actually cook the potatoes and the turnips together. And also I do this with parsnips as well. And then mash it all together. And you end up with mashed potatoes that has extra flavor because of the parsnips and or the turnips. So that's another good way to do it. I prefer the roasting, but mashing them all together into the potatoes is another great way to do that. And DLR978 says, Cold Cannon, Irish mashed potato dish with melted butter and bacon is awesome with rutabaga. There you go. Scottish recipe called Neeps and Tatties. That's good. See what you can learn on this chat we have every Monday. That's fantastic. Neeps and Tatties. I'll have to try to remember that for the next time I make that dish as well. And you're very welcome, Socks in the Garden. Yes, yum is exactly right. Mala's trying to get me to play with her right here. I don't know if you can hear her bouncing her toys at my feet, but she's in playing mode right now. Oh yes, and Sherry says, don't forget to mash garlic in with your root veggies. Yeah, thank you for that. I should have mentioned that. I use garlic in so many of the things I make. I just don't even really think about it. It's just an automatic addition. But yes, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. And garlic is one of those things. I made some chili yesterday and used some of my garlic. I always like chopping up my garlic. I use my garlic in when I make my pickles. And one thing you'll see in the video coming out on Thursday is I made a cucumber dip, and I used my garlic in the cucumber dip. So absolutely, Sherry, that's goes without saying. If it's something I'm cooking in the kitchen, it usually involves garlic, and almost always it's the garlic that I'm growing. Shandy's Garden mashed everything. I'm also going to freeze dry those things for pouches of instant sides. Absolutely. Who else is obsessed with smoked paprika? Such a lovely meaty taste. So it's interesting that you say that. So I've actually got some Hungarian peppers that are growing in the garden. I meant to harvest them this weekend, but I'm going to do it this week. But I'm planning on making my own paprika because it is absolutely wonderful. And that's what I'm planning on doing. I need to learn more about it before I actually take the step, but I'm planning on smoking my Hungarian peppers to make a smoked paprika of my own. So I won't quite say I'm obsessed with it, But yesterday I made an egg sandwich and I sprinkled my paprika. Not the paprika I made, but the paprika that I already have, because it is one of those taste sensations that can really raise the level of what you're eating, especially eggs. I think paprika with eggs is particularly good. So thank you for that idea. Gina says, I harvested 30 heads of garlic this year, and sadly they'll be gone by Christmas. Need twice as much. Yeah, that's one reason why I planted so much garlic last year, was because I am always needing more. The problem is, this goes back to our conversation with Jason. This year, for reasons we are still trying to figure out, it was a terrible garlic year in my area. I planted a whole bunch of garlic last year and only got a fraction of what I planted. Weird weather in winter, weird weather in spring, and weird weather going into summer. Terrible for our garlic crops this year. So this is the first year in a while. I actually ordered garlic bulbs. They're supposed to be delivered within the next week or so, because so much of my garlic failed this last year that I didn't have the heads to plant because I've been using it. So I actually bought some more garlic to plant. So I hope I don't have a bad year. I always have a good year of garlic, except for this year. But you're right, that's one of those things. The more you use garlic, the more you got to plant, and the more space it takes up in your garden, which is a good thing. I'm not complaining about that, but it really is one of those things that you can get hooked and just keep buying more, keep growing more, and hopefully you can get to the point where you can stop the buying and just keep growing what it is that you harvest on your own. So Leafy Green says, growing garlic makes me really appreciate being able to buy it at the grocery store. Actually, it likes that with a lot of crops. Really gives you a new appreciation. Yes, absolutely. Well, so much of gardening is that way. When we grow what we grow and we compare it to what we can buy, it really can give you a new appreciation. So thanks for that. And Yankee Sister Homestead, absolutely. Don't know if you can ever grow enough garlic. And so that was the nice thing. Last year I had a great crop, and I completely agree with you. I had so much garlic, I didn't know what to do with it. And so that's why I started making garlic powder and garlic salt, drying and freeze drying my garlic so that I could use it in other ways and preserve it. Pickled garlic, fermented garlic, and you can use it in so many different ways that I agree with you. I don't think you ever can have too much garlic. Heidi says, my music garlic was the only variety that got large heads. The rest produced but were smaller. So in a month or so, I will only plant music garlic. Sadly, I used all my garlic from last year's crop. Well, and coincidentally, Heidi, that's the garlic that I bought. I had that same issue. I love music. Music gives me the biggest heads, and even though some of my music came through over this last winter, I bought more music garlic to plant because it is going to end up being the primary garlic that I grow. So I like you, like the big heads. I like the flavor, and it does do successful. Even in a bad year, it does well in my garden. So that's what I bought is music to make sure I've got enough going forward, because I have been using more than I should have, and I need more to put into the ground. So it is a good one. Sherry is wondering, have you ever made black garlic slowly cured in high heat, like hanging in an attic? It's so pungent. I haven't. I've had a few people in recent months watching one of my garlic videos and asking me the same thing. And so I haven't, but I have looked into it, and I've been thinking about doing it next year as I move into next year's garlic crop and trying the black garlic. It looks quite interesting, but no, I haven't done it before. And if I do it, of course, I'll report to you and let you know how it works. But it does look quite interesting. Brian's wondering, has anyone grown northern white garlic, picked up some bulbs to plant in zone 5A? I think, I'm not sure if it was the northern white. I grew a white garlic a few years back and did well as I remember, but I can't report specifically on the northern white. And Yankee Sister says, I love music garlic because of Garner Scott. Well, thank you for that. It's a very popular one, and I think a lot of people like music because it is so good. Kathy's saying, I'm hoping the bulbs are going to fill out on my soft neck garlic yet. It's at least a month behind this year, and I wanted to redo where it's sitting for my hard neck garlic yet. And so, that's one of the things as you get close to the harvest time of garlic is helping ensure the conditions are right. It's still a growing plant. It's still going to benefit from moist soil and sun, and often, especially the soft neck varieties, they'll put on a lot of growth in the last month before they harvest. So yes, I hope that they fill out for you as well. And there's always hope because it's the end where they begin growing. And it's kind of like that last burst of growth saps all their energy. And that's when the leaves start turning brown and signify that it's time to start harvesting. So maybe you're getting close to that point. Gail's saying, I grew 4 varieties of garlic, but music and German are my best performers. The garden is still very green, and I need to make space to plant next year's garlic in about 3 weeks. So there you go, another advocate of music. And I also like the German. I think I had a German red that I've been growing that does really well. In addition to, I've got a Russian purple that I also really like. And you talked about next 3 weeks. This week, my plan is to rip out one of my cucumber beds, my pickling cucumber bed. It did so great. I've made so many pickles, and it's starting to falter. I'm just not harvesting a fraction of what I was a month ago. That means it's time to pull the plants, put in a little bit of compost, and that's what I'm going to be doing in that bed, is putting in the garlic. So for those of us, as we're moving into the cooling conditions of fall and we want to grow garlic, now's the time to start thinking about getting that bed ready to go. And it's probably 2 to 3 weeks for many of us will be the ideal time to start planting the garlic. And so, yes, that's high on my list of activities this week, is to get my garlic bed ready. Well, because all my beds are filled with plants, it also means taking out a plant that is faltering. Goodbye cucumbers, hello garlic. And I suspect that some of you are probably in that same mode where it's the end of the season, you want to get that last little bit of cucumber, you want to get those last few squashes, but you also want to do garlic. Go ahead and pull the plants. It's never fun to pull a plant that's still alive, but if it's not producing for you, make the space available for something else. Either a cool season plant that will be part of your fall or winter garden, or the garlic. And the garlic, of course, is a high priority on my list. Hello to Bowtie Life. Nice to have you here again with us today. I just finished my fall seed starting. Garlic is next on my agenda as well. So good for you. And that fits into the beginning of October. That's definitely something that fits with a lot of us. And Gardens Happen in Florida is also getting into that mode of putting the seeds in. And plans to plant the Chico broccoli this year. So good for you. Hope it turns out well for you. I'm a bit envious of you because you can grow into the winter, whereas my season is getting real close to being over. So have fun with that broccoli. Those cooling conditions in the southern U.S., like the parts of Florida where you you all are beginning the seeding of your winter gardens. I think that's just so fantastic that you can be doing that. Let's see, Socks in the Garden saying, I tried Armenian cukes for the first time this year, and they were yummy. We'll be growing those from now on. Good for you. Yeah, the Armenian cukes, totally different type of plant, and definitely a nice flavor, especially if they do well for you. I tried them last year and had mixed success, so I didn't do it this year, but I think next year I may give it another try. So good for you. And Gail says, on a whim, I planted loofah this year. They're going crazy. Loofah gourds are a wonderful plant. I'm not sure there's enough season for them to turn brown. Can I save them green if necessary? So yes, you should leave them on the plant as long as possible. And if they can start changing color and get to that point where they're beginning to brown, then bringing them in will give you better results. When I've grown loofahs in the past and we had a long season and they were able to dry on the plant, they were perfect. When I had to harvest them after a frost or just before a frost and they were green, they still did pretty well, and you'll still get some loofahs as part of the, I'm guessing you want the loofah, like the loofah sponge that you use in the bath or shower. You'll still get those even from the green, but they won't be fully formed. And the problem I had when I have done that in the past using the green ones is they're much more susceptible to mold on the inside because they haven't dried. It's still wet. And so when you put them in your kitchen or grow room to continue drying, they're still so wet that they're really not going to dry, and they'll get moldy and they might end up rotting. So that's the big reason to leave them out as long as possible on the plant so that they can begin that drying process on the plant and they're less likely to mold. The green ones can get pretty mushy and moldy pretty soon if they haven't passed that point of maturity where they formed that nice hard interior that we know of as the loofah sponge. So keeping my fingers crossed for you and hope that works out. And Yankee Sister says, pulled my tomatoes because of splitting due to 4 inches of rain for a stretch of days. Yeah, it's crazy. In Connecticut, and especially New York made the national news, just the amount of rain coming in that area in a very short period of time set records and definitely posed problems for everybody. But yeah, gardeners, you have a big inrush of the water and your tomatoes are going to split. So sorry to hear that, but hopefully it'll be ready to get you started in whatever the next phase of your gardening will be. So let's hope that it all works out as well as it can. So one of the other things I want to talk about when we're sharing our gardens, and so far I've been focusing on sharing your gardens with people in your area, but kind of what we're doing right now, I think that's also an important factor, is to share your garden and what's happening and what you're doing with gardeners in completely different areas. And so Eli and Kate and I have made a few videos now where we've been comparing our tomatoes between Scotland and Colorado. And I've learned a lot, and I know they've learned a lot as well, because we're having that conversation, because we can actually put side by side what I'm doing in Colorado and what they're doing in Scotland and compare and contrast those activities. And again, it's so educational because I can see that what I'm doing is working for me, but it might not work for them, and vice versa. And they can do something and I give it a try and maybe it works for me and maybe it doesn't. So 2 different ways to look at gardening when we talk about comparing our gardens. It's people that are doing it in the same place with the same conditions, and then people that are doing it in completely different environments And I think you can learn from both. And it's all part of that journey. It's all part of getting us to that next level of gardening expertise when we can compare what we're doing with someone else that's totally different. Now the analysis comes in and the learning comes in, and maybe it will modify how you're growing your plants and the approach you take to growing your plants. So always good to seek out that information. And there's Jay right on top of things with a link to In the Garden with Eli and Kate's channel. Lots of good information. And, different levels of gardening, different locations. And I learn stuff all the time. That's one of my favorite channels. I've said that many times because I learn things from that channel. And that's a big reason why I watch YouTube, is to learn. And so I'll definitely stick with people that I can learn from. Skippy Dugan's wondering, how's your son's garden and what are his plans since he has a different climate? Just curious how you two differ in approach. So good question. So my son lives in Louisiana, and I'm actually going to be visiting him in almost exactly a month. Yeah, I think it is exactly a month. I'll be visiting him. And so he's just starting with his gardening moving forward. The thing that he's still working on, and I'll be helping him when I go out there in a month, is building the beds, filling the beds, and getting started with that way. So he's only been doing a little bit of gardening, just figuring out some things about growing in Louisiana. His big push for the gardening is going to be coming this next year after he gets his beds done. He's been focusing this summer on chickens and turkeys and getting them all settled in. So he has a barn and a coop, things that he's been building with a focus on the chickens primarily. And so the garden is coming. So thank you for asking that question. And we talk often about what the garden will be and what he can grow. I've been encouraging, once that he gets the beds built in the next month or so, that he'll be able to have a winter garden. And so that's kind of, I think, where it's headed. I'm encouraging him to do a winter garden in the beds I'm going to help him with. And I'll let you know as we move forward how the gardening in Louisiana works out. It's completely different because a month from now, my garden is going to be completely done, and his is going to be in a position where he can start getting the plants going. And a big issue with Louisiana and those regions that are hot and muggy is you don't want to get out and do gardening in the summer, but you've also got so many insects and so many animals that will eat your plants and cause problems in the garden that it makes more sense to wait and do winter gardening when you don't have those insects, you don't have those same pests, and the conditions are much more enjoyable to be outside. So those are a couple big differences in what we've already talked about with the gardens that we have in two totally different areas. So more to follow on that front, and we'll just have to wait and see what plants he chooses to grow. One of the things he's been talking about in this last week, as we were talking about gardening, is growing plants and seeds for his chickens. So one of his first plans with the beds he's building is to grow chicken food, because he's up to, I think he's got 10 chickens now, might even have 12. And when you have to buy feed, it definitely cuts into your budget. But if you can grow your own chicken feed and definitely help with their diet and save your own budget, that's a nice approach to take. So that's one of the things he's thinking about doing and looking into is growing chicken food and approach gardening from that perspective. I've talked about this before. We all have different reasons why we garden. Our gardens serve different purposes for each of us, whether it's growing food, getting exercise, helping with your mental health, or feeding your chickens. So it's such a fantastic activity that we can all be growing plants plants in our garden, but we might have completely different reasons for growing the plants. And another reason to have those conversations and to share ideas back and forth, because if you've got chickens and you've never thought about growing food for your chickens, well, maybe it's time to start thinking about doing that kind of thing. So always good ideas that we can get from others, and that's an important thing to start thinking about. So thank you for that, Jay. He's not doing, this is my son's channel, he's actually not doing the Brew Captain so much anymore. As he's getting his chickens and as he's starting his garden, he actually has a different channel that he's doing his primary focus on. It's Ready, Set, Homestead is his channel, and that's where he is making some videos about his chickens and building the coop and those things. So he's still getting started with that. So thank you for that link. But Ready, Set, Homestead is actually the channel that he's starting to do more focus on. And apparently there's 2 channels with that name. And so his is I think it's Ready, Set, Homestead US or something along those lines. But anyway, the basic name is Ready, Set, Homestead. Big guy with a beard, that's my son. And it's fun. He has some good shorts recently with him dealing with his chickens. So I love watching those, not only to see my son and grandchildren, but also to see what he's having to do with his chickens. Jane is saying, my husband has let me tear up the yard to put in the raised beds, but he draws the line at chickens. Yeah, we'll see. That might change. My daughter has chickens, and that was one of those things. They would never have chickens, and then she ended up with chickens. So there's still hope for you. Keep your fingers crossed for that. Gardens Happen says cheap air popcorn from the grocery store can be grown for chicken feed or more popcorn. Yeah, I've mentioned that to him. That popcorn is one of those things, and I haven't had great success with popcorn, but I suggested that popcorn or even just feed corn might be an option to grow in Louisiana. So we'll have to see if that's one of those things that he adds to his list. Brian says, my garden is split. Front is open and rear is fenced in, and the deer feast on anything grown out front. You know, I've got that same deer problem as well. And I'm guessing what some of the things you've learned, and you know, as we talk about deer in our gardens, I grow different plants in different areas because of the deer and where the deer are coming in. And so that's one of those things, especially if you've got a definite difference in the front and the back. I'm guessing, and this is one of those things you can share what you do as a result of it, the plants you grow will be different from one area to another. I put tulip bulbs in when I first moved to this house in the front yard and not in the backyard, because at that point I knew that there were deer that would go in the back. And I love tulips and I wanted the flowers in the springtime, so I put tulips in the front yard. And the first year, sure enough, I had tulips growing. What I didn't know was that some of the young deer that we have just walk up and down the street in the early morning, and they discovered my tulips. So I have another area in the back that I've noticed the deer don't get to, and I suspected that they would. And so I'm planning to put my tulips in my backyard again. So sometimes with the deer, we'd have to keep swapping where our plants go until we can finally find the spot that works best to keep the plants going and not have the deer chew on them. So it's definitely a battle. I added a lot of wire. I put wire over my strawberries this year because last year, in an area that I didn't think the deer would discover, the deer discovered my strawberries and just ate them down to nothing. So this year, put wire over them, and I actually got some strawberries because the deer weren't eating my strawberries. So it's always a battle when we have to fight them. And Tennessee Nana says they also eat mums. Yeah, I had mums growing in my front yard for the same reason as the tulips. and I don't have mums growing in my front yard anymore because the deer have come in and eaten all of them. So one of those things just to consider. So Bowtie Life says popping popcorn is never GMO. You cannot pop a GMO corn ever. So that's good to know. I know that most of the corn and corn oil and corn syrup and those corn related products in commercial agriculture are GMO crops. I had suspected that popcorn might be the same, but thank you for telling us that. And for those of you, I've got video that talks about it. Our vegetable garden seeds are not GMO either. And so much of what we're going to be, actually everything we're going to be growing in our garden is not going to be GMO seed. The GMO seed is all produced at the agricultural level for big farms. And so it's something that we don't even have to think about. But never thought about commercial popcorn necessarily. So there you have it. But within our garden, I'm not worried about GMOs at all because it's something that they're not making. It's too expensive a process to waste on backyard gardeners. That basically is what it comes down to. So take that in mind as you move forward. Jason says, I envy all of you with your property, especially in rural towns. Yes, I will have to say it took many years to reach the point where I could have some rural property and have big gardens. But I do love it. And I fully understand, Jason. For much of my life, I envied people who had property and could put in their big gardens and grow what they wanted to do. So maybe the time is still come for you, Jason, that you can have that as well. It's one of those things that, and there you go. I was going to say the same thing as Tennessee Nana. It's surprising how much you can grow in a few containers or just a few beds. Yeah, I have a lot of beds because I make a lot of videos. That's a big reason why I have as much as I do, is because I just like building a garden, and then I like making the videos and sharing what I'm doing in my garden. But almost all of what I've harvested this year and preserved and eaten has just come from a few beds and a few containers. So yeah, it really is surprising how much you can get from a small space if you put a focus into that small space for the harvest aspect of it. A lot of what I do, I just do because I like doing it. But when it comes to the growing of the food, it's a very small space that I have in my garden really devoted to that. And so even in a small suburban or city lot, it's surprising what you can actually get in a small space. So just keep active with it and just keep learning how to do more and more. And so it's nice to see all the conversations going back and forth with Jason. Yeah, I hope so too. That's one of those things that the whole gardening thing, and again, that's why talking to other gardeners can help with that. I occasionally mention the gardener I know that has his whole garden on his driveway in 5-gallon buckets. And I never thought of that as an option until I talked to a gardener and he shared what he was doing about his gardening. And so since then, almost every year I grow something in 5-gallon buckets. This year I've got early girl tomatoes on my patio. And as the name implies, they were the earliest tomato that I was harvesting, growing in 5-gallon buckets. I've got potatoes that I grow in buckets. So yeah, it is pretty incredible. And there's a lot that you can do in a small space for that anywhere. Jim Edgar, thank you so much for that. Deer wiped out my peppers except the habaneros. I found one with a bite on the ground. New deer repellent? Potentially it is. That's one of those concoctions you may have seen videos or a blog on about making a deer repellent out of garlic and hot peppers. And it definitely works for a lot of people. So it's very possible that you found a deer repellent. The problem is especially with something like the chili pepper sprays that you put around your garden to deter the deer, is they have to eat it first to then be deterred. So they're probably still going to come into your garden, they're still going to munch on some things, and they're not going to eat the things that you spray. But unless you spray everything, they're probably going to keep eating and finding the other plants that they like to eat. But yeah, habaneros, grow a whole bunch of habaneros, and maybe that could be something to experiment with and spray and see if you could protect some of those plants like the tulips and the mums that the deers just love to chow on until they get that hot pepper bite. And then maybe their attitude will change about those flowers. And you can modify the behavior of animals like that. My last house, we had a lot of deer coming through on a regular basis, and I was able to use repellents and netting and fencing to affect their behavior to the point that they didn't come by as often because they learned that there was nothing in my garden to waste time on. So they would just walk down the street. And I've taken a lot of pictures and a lot of video standing at that house's front door, just watching the deer walk past my yard, even when I had all the plants that were growing that they might normally eat. They just didn't even bother anymore. So yeah, train your deer to stay away from the garden by spraying it and fencing it. And after a while, you don't need to spray because they're just not coming around anymore. It actually can work pretty well. Jay's saying, when I was assistant manager of an urban farm, the only sure deer protection was correctly installed deer fence. Absolutely. Yeah, in my video where I talk about keeping deer out of your landscape, keeping deer out of your garden, how to deer proof your garden. That's what I say in that video, is the only way to deer proof your garden is to fence it. It's to have deer proof fencing. And that really is the only way to do it. Completely agree with you. You can deter deer with all the concoctions you make, but a barrier between the deer and your plants, that's the only sure method. And it's just a question of whether you want to take that effort or you can afford to do the effort to fence in the garden to keep the deer out. But yep, absolutely right. That's the only way to be sure about it. And so, Gail, again, I've been studying a lot about compost. I read that compost can help plants be more disease resistant since many diseases are airborne. How does compost help? So there's a couple trains of thought or schools of thought when it comes to this. So, and Jason and I were just talking about this yesterday at lunch, as a matter of fact. So compost, with all of its nutrients and all of its bacteria, when you add it to your soil, you're making a healthier soil environment. And the healthy soil helps ensure that you have healthy plants. And so the healthier the soil, the healthier the plant. And there's actually some research I've seen. There's a horticulturist that has made some videos, a plant scientist, and his theory is that a healthy plant does not get disease or is eaten by pests, because healthy plants have their own defense mechanisms to keep that from happening. It's the weak plants, the plants that aren't healthy, that get eaten and that get diseases. And often it's the other way around. They get the disease, which weakens them even more, which brings in the pests, and then the pests eat the weakened plant. So that's one way that the compost can help in a situation like that, is by making a healthy soil, which makes for a healthy plant. And I think that's the most important aspect of it. The other is that the bacteria that's in the compost also helping to generate a healthy biome within the soil. It is out competing the hazardous or bad soil microbes. So when you've got a a fungus or a virus or a bacteria that's in the soil that could harm your plant, the healthy soil that's generated from the compost generates the good bacteria that defeats the bad bacteria, very simplistically. And so many of the airborne diseases that get onto our plants originate in the soil. It's the spores from that soil fungus that blows onto our plants. It's the virus from the soil that blows onto our plants. It's the bacteria from the soil that blows onto the plants. And so if you can defeat all of those potential diseases in the soil before they can be blown into the wind, that's definitely something you should consider. And compost helps with that. Along with mulch, if you can just cover the soil so that those things never become airborne, that's another way that you can increase the likelihood that your plants are going to survive an encounter or prevent an encounter in the first place. So there's a couple things that I've read about that might help you as far as why compost can reduce disease in the garden, and it almost completely focuses on the soil and what the soil can do. Now there are some studies and some minimal research I've read about the compost tea. So if you take your compost and make a tea and then you spray that tea on the leaves as a foliar feed, that has some antifungal properties. So that's another way that you might be able to protect your plants. But I don't think there's anything definitive yet that says how effective that might be and how effective it is at a number of different diseases. But there is some information you might be able to find out about that. So a couple ideas. Compost is just one of those magical things that we can add to our garden and see its benefits. And I've actually got some rough compost that I'm going to be using as mulch moving into the winter. So you don't have to do compost to mix into your soil. You can also do compost and use it as a mulch and achieve many of the same benefits. So compost is just gotta do compost. Well, the first thing I did it at this garden, and I think I did it at the last garden, and I did it at the garden before. So my last 3 gardens, the very first structure I built in my garden was a compost bin. Taking some pallets and screwing them together and starting my compost before I even started the garden. So no reason that you can't do that. If you don't have a compost pile yet, start it. It really does make a difference. So let's go ahead and talk about the background at this point in our show. This comes from Carla Garner, and she wanted to point out to me, and I think it's a great example of how you can have a garden in a space that you might not normally think you could have a garden. And so this is a RV parking spot right off the street. And you can see just behind this garden is the neighbor's RV parking spot with gravel, nothing growing on it. And what Carla decided to do was take out the gravel, put in a wood chip mulch, put in some raised beds, and grow a garden right there on the street. And I love this because this is one of those things I think we as gardeners are hesitant sometimes to tell others that we're gardeners. I keep telling you we should share what we're doing with other gardeners. That's easy. It's easy for us to talk about gardening with other gardeners. It's harder for us to talk about gardening with non-gardeners. And it's even harder for us to garden in an area where our neighbors might see it. And we don't want the criticism. We don't want the blowback if someone thinks we're not doing it right. Because what's right in this neighborhood? Well, apparently what's right is to have a gravel parking lot for your RV. But Carla stepped beyond this and said, no, what's right for me is to put a garden in my front yard where everybody could see. And look at that fantastic corn. Look at that squash. And so I think this is just a wonderful example of how a gardener can move beyond the expectations that we might have and that others might have, and put a garden in a space where no one else is putting a garden. And I understand those of us that have an HOA and an HOA might prohibit it. That's okay. There's other options, other things you might choose to do. But if you don't have that restriction, expand your garden to include right off your driveway and your sidewalk and an RV parking spot. And if you don't have an RV, then it's just wasted space. So use it for something like gardening and corn and squash. And think about the conversation piece that Carla has as people are walking up and down the sidewalk and they see this. I just think it's fantastic. So thank you for sharing this, Carla. I hope you have done this now and it's motivated others to try similar things, because it definitely motivates me to add more plants to my front and to get more people talking about what's growing in my front yard. And I've got a lot of plants in my front yard already, but I don't have corn growing. And I think I'm tempted to grow corn in my front yard next year. So see, when we share our gardens, share ideas, I've never thought about growing corn in my front yard until Carla sent me this picture. And it's like, I think I might grow corn in my front yard next year. I don't have a good spot in my backyard for corn, but my front yard soil is much better and I've got a spot. So I don't know, maybe you'll see a video about that in the future. So always good ideas to pass on. And I'd love to see your garden, and I'm running low on the background pictures. I need more. So send me your pictures. gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com is the email address. Send me a picture of your gardening idea, what's happening in your space. Do make it landscape, please. I had some photos sent to me this week that were in portrait mode, and they just don't work as a background photo. So they really need to be landscape, full file size, and then give me permission. Say that you're sending it to me so I can use it on the Monday live stream, and I'll add it to the queue. And that's what Carla did, and that's why you're seeing it here today. So I hope to see your garden in the days ahead. Two gals, thank you so much for that. And I just love Mondays too. And it's probably my favorite gardening day of the week, because I always think of Mondays as the first day of the week. And this is how I get my week started, is talking about gardening on Monday morning. So what can be better than that? So thank you for that. And I appreciate the donation and I appreciate the words. And it's definitely one of those things that I appreciate all of you on Mondays. And thank you, Jason, as well for that. I appreciate the donation and so glad you could be here and active with everything that's going on today. That's one of the nice things about this group, is just how active so many of you are. Now, I know there are a lot of you behind the scenes, and it's easy to watch and it's easy to listen. And I know a lot of you are taking notes as we talk, and you're not the kind to be active in the chat. That's okay. I watch live streams and I'm not active in the chat either. I completely get it. But just be aware, for all of you who haven't commented and haven't asked a question and haven't sent a photo, you are welcome to. This is such a welcoming group that if you've got a question that you are wondering about and just feel like maybe it's not something you should ask, or you're just a little bit afraid about asking a question with a group like this, please don't feel that way. Go ahead and ask your questions in the comments, and I assure you, you'll get good response and hopefully a good answer that you're looking for. And I am loving all of the people that are here every single week, the regulars, but I know there's a bunch of you who are regulars that we never hear from. So maybe that'll entice you a little bit to get involved and ask some of your questions. Boothby Gardens, can corn grow on an incline? Yes, it can. I mean, there is a limit to the incline. Corn does require some water, and the problem with any plant we're growing on an incline is that it can lead to erosion as we try to water our plants. And so whenever I grow on an incline, I try to level it out enough so that the plants are growing on a level surface. And so if you have an incline, cut away some of the soil from the upside of the hill and move it to the downside of the hill and make a flat spot. And even if that spot is only 3 feet wide, that's enough for corn. Look at the space that Carla's growing in. It doesn't need to be a very wide spot. So yes, it can grow on an incline, but it will grow better on a flat spot. And so just move some of the soil on the incline to get that flat area that you can grow the corn. And that holds true with the other questions that or the other plants that you're going to be growing, is they're going to do better on a flat surface than the inclined surface. Sure, ivies and vining plants will do just fine on a slope, but most of the plants we're growing in our vegetable garden in particular want level ground to do best. So keep that in mind as you start thinking about the preparation. That's one of the reasons why I like building the garden. And I moved a lot of dirt this week. I've added a bed in an area you haven't seen before in any of my videos. I haven't shot there because there haven't been plants there. I now have 2 fruit trees, and I've put in a raised bed that's going to be filled with strawberries next year. Well, because of the incline from one end to the other, it's about a foot, maybe 15 to 18 inches. And so as I put in the raised bed in between the trees, I hadn't realized it was that much of a difference from one side to the other side of this large area. So I moved in a lot of dirt. I dug dirt out of the lower end of my garden, put it in my wheelbarrow, pushed it all the way through the garden to the other side, and leveled that area before I put the raised bed in, so that I didn't have to worry about growing in a slope or on a slope, and I could put the bed and all the plants that will go around that bed on level ground. So it may be a little bit of work, but that is one of those things that I think is important as you plan your plants, is to go ahead and plan for moving the soil if you need to, and then creating the space where the plants are going to do best. So let's go to Luna. Great to see you live, Scott. Well, so glad you could be here. And I know a lot of people talk about that. I got a lot of people that watch and replay because they can't be here live. So glad you can be here live, because it is a great experience. It's also good in replay, but I think it's better if you can make that comment and ask that question. Mountains and Mayhem, are iPhone pictures high enough resolution for the background picture? Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually the problem, is it was an iPhone photo, resolution was fine, it was just taken in portrait mode, up and down. And so when I put it, if you notice, this background is in landscape mode. So if I take the portrait mode and put it into the landscape mode, what you're trying to show gets pushed to the side or up or down, and it doesn't work out. So yeah, iPhones have definitely enough resolution. Just make sure you do it in the landscape mode, side to side, so that it'll fit in the background. And a lot of the photos I get, the resolution is so good that for this software I use, I'll often resize the photo with a lower resolution, just so it doesn't take up the bandwidth, or I don't know what other issues it might cause, but it causes the software to look at it differently if the resolution is too high. iPhones, no problem. Some of the photos I've used of my garden as a background have been my own iPhone photos. So yes, Mountains and Mayhem, send me a photo of your garden and use your iPhone to do it, and it'll work out just fine. So thanks for asking. And Socks in the Garden says, always love learning new things from each live stream. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's not hard, but I do try to take time to think about what's appropriate for the time of year and what topic I want to focus on in any given week. But if you look at it, in the 90 minutes that we're together, the topic of the week, sharing our gardens, is maybe only 20 minutes of it, 25 minutes. The bulk is you guys and your questions and your comments. So that's the part of the Mondays I like that I can't program and can't plan for, is getting the questions from you all and then covering those questions and sharing information as we move forward. So it definitely takes a group to make these Mondays work as best as they do. So my shout out to all of you who are here now on the live, making it work so much better. Jason's wondering, can you do more indoor grows? So I've been thinking about that. I have pepper plants growing in my hydroponic system right now, and the plants are doing great. They're like 4 feet tall. The issue that I've been having, and the reason you're not seeing more videos of my indoor growing, is because I'm still figuring it out. And so I did some videos about my hydroponic system and setup, and I did a video talking about the nutrients and what I was going to do, and it worked great for the plants, but the balance wasn't right for the plants I was growing. I think it was too much nitrogen to grow my peppers, so I got really big plants. I didn't get a lot of flowers. I changed my nutrition ratio to put in more phosphorus and less nitrogen. I started getting some flowers, but not a lot of fruiting. So I'm still trying to figure it out. Before, I don't feel as comfortable making a video saying, here's a video and I don't know what I'm talking about. Here's a video and I'm still trying to figure things out. I'd rather do a video with the answers already figured out. So yes, you can expect that I'll be doing more videos on my indoor growing, but I'm still doing a lot of figuring out before I get to that point where I make those videos. So it's coming, still experimenting. I know it's hard, like we were talking about earlier, ripping out cucumbers to put in. The garlic makes perfect sense. I'm about ready to rip out my pepper plants with the indoor grow because it's just not working. And the pepper plants I put in, I did the same thing before. My tomato plants in my basement were 10 feet tall and almost no fruit on them. And that's what first led me to think the nutrients were off. So I pulled out my tomato plants, I put in some pepper plants, modified, still too much nitrogen. And so now I'm gonna have to pull out the pepper plants and put other plants in until I get it figured out. So that's all part of gardening. Yeah, you might think I get everything right all the time because I've been doing this for so long, but not at all. As I try new things, it's just like all of you. There's no guarantee it's going to work, and I'm still in that mode trying to figure out what's going to work. Jane's growing garden. Will you be growing anything outdoors over the winter? No, I can't grow anything, and literally nothing grows for me. So I'm in zone 5B, which means that my winter temperatures, my lowest average winter temperature is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 26 Celsius. And that is so cold, nothing grows. And so even in my greenhouse, I'll be able to maintain a temperature warmer than that, but it'll still be too cold to grow anything. So in my area of Colorado, it's just too cold to grow anything. Now being said, I have an unheated greenhouse, and that's why I shut down all my growing, because the unheated greenhouse is warmer, but it's not warm enough to grow anything. And until I get electricity in my greenhouse and I can heat it and add lights, I'm not going to be growing anything outside. So that day may come, but it's not here now. And so this winter, nothing will be growing outside. And I'll shift to the inside, like the indoor growing stuff that I was just talking about. And then we'll have to see what kind of videos result as part of that growing. Hi, Sherry. My cuttings of tomato plants are growing water roots. Should I feed them? And so if they're still in the water and the roots are starting to grow from them, I would say go ahead and put them into pots of soil. And then yes, they should have some nutrition once either once they're in the soil. If the soil has the nutrients in it, the fertilizers, the worm castings, the compost, then you may not need to add more. If you're putting it into a potting mix that doesn't have those nutrients, then yes, you should feed them. If you don't want to do that, then yes, go ahead and put some fertilizer, some liquid fertilizer into the containers that you've got that are rooting them. The problem that I usually see, and it gets back to what I was just talking about with the hydroponic system. It's really hard to figure the nutrient levels that a plant needs when it's growing in water. And so guessing at what nutrients you need to add to your tomato cuttings to keep them growing is more of a challenge, I think, than if you put them into soil. And most of us have a much better understanding of the nutrient levels that are present in soil, or how we're growing in that soil and how we add the nutrients to it. So it's kind of a guess in the water, and it's more certain in soil, which is a big reason why I think, and I did that with my sweet potatoes last year. I had my slips in the water, and as soon as they started showing the roots, I put them into little pots and then continued growing the slips in the soil, because it was easier for me to maintain the nutrient level in a potting mix than it was to try to maintain the nutrient level in water. And but that's just the way I look at it. So that would be my suggestion, Sherry, is to move them and start growing them like a tomato plant in a pot. CJ Don, my sweet potato plants are doing excellent. Good to hear. I have now relocated them in my raised beds as a cover crop. Awesome. First time trying this. I hope I can get better yields next year. Great idea. I like that. If you didn't know, sweet potato leaves are edible. And so don't be afraid to eat some of those leaves. But I love the idea of a cover crop with the sweet potato plants. My sweet potato plants have not done that well this year, but I've been thinking similar thoughts. I was going to dig one of the plants up here soon and see if there's anything to harvest. But as I move forward and the temperatures are falling in my area, it's too cold for the sweet potato plants to do well and give me good sweet potatoes, but they're still growing. And I've been thinking the same thing, using my sweet potatoes as a cover crop. And then when they finally do die, just turning them into the soil, into the raised beds that I have them in, and using the sweet potato leaves as organic matter to help improve the soil. So I love that idea. Sweet potatoes are not normally thought of as a cover crop, but good for you for thinking about that and giving it a try. That's fantastic. Colorado Bird Nerd, nice to see you. I hope you have been enjoying our weather. The cold is coming. Thank you for another wonderful Monday morning garden chat. Oh, you're so welcome. I learn so much and always get such great advice and new ideas. Thank you for that. And it's sharing. It's like I said, it's not just me, it's what everybody else is saying as well. So thank you for that donation, and thank you for being here, as you often are in Mondays. Coastal Gardens, Northwest, it's getting close to garlic planting time for me. Can you recommend any feed to add to the ground first? So my feed for my garlic is compost. And that's what I mentioned at the beginning of the show. You may have joined afterwards, but I was talking about that's what I'm going to be doing this week, is preparing my garlic bed with compost. And that's pretty much all I do. In new beds, brand new beds that I'm just filling and just creating, I might add a slow release organic fertilizer to help kickstart the biome within the soil and to get some of the nutrients that the plants will need. But once my beds are established, and I don't know how the soil is in your beds, but it just takes a regular amendment of compost in fall, And that's all I do. That's what I recommend. And that's how I feed my soil, because I'm feeding the soil. I'm not feeding the plant. The soil feeds the plant. And so if I can feed the soil with more organic matter, more compost, more food for the soil microbes, they'll feed the plants. And especially this time of year, I'm amending with the compost in my beds. They're going to be dormant. Like I just said, it gets so cold here, nothing is growing. The bacteria shuts down and goes dormant in the winter. There's nothing growing in my garden in winter. When the soil begins to warm up in spring, that compost that I put into the soil now is still there. It did not decompose over the winter because there was no microbe activity to decompose the compost. So even when you amend in fall, those nutrients are still available to the plants in spring and summer because of just the dormancy and then the waking up and the repopulating and the breaking down of the soil. And then the plants are put in and the nutrients are in that soil and then the plants take off. So that's what I recommend, is feeding the soil with organic matter. And compost, of course, is my organic matter of choice. You could do worm castings. You could do alfalfa, like we were talking about earlier. You can do grass clippings. I also do a lot of crushed leaves because that encourages the fungal activity within the soil. So organic matter of all kinds in the fall. And if you have access to manures, and aged manures tend to be better because they are already on that path towards decomposition. Putting aged manures in your soil in the fall is another great way to help encourage the soil life. And manures are one of those favorite food of worms. So that helps increase the earthworm population. So organic matter, organic matter, organic matter is the thing to do if you're looking to help your plants out and enrich your soil. And this is a good time of doing it. And even for those of you like Rick in Australia, springtime, as you're getting ready for your plants to be growing, it's the same thing. It's all about the organic matter. If you didn't amend in the fall, you can still do it in the spring. Because once those temperatures start rising, the soil life is going to spring into action and they're looking for food. And so compost in the spring is a great backup or follow-up to your soil preparation. And in the spring, I like to do it at least a month. 6 to 8 weeks is better before the plants go in the ground so that those microbes have some time to begin breaking down that organic matter and making it available to plants. But still the same answer. Spring or fall, organic matter is the way to deal with the plants and take care of them in the way that they need to be taken care of. And good night, Rick. I see that you're signing off. You may have already signed off. So thanks for being here in those early hours in Australia. It's so nice that you could be here. And so nice that all the others, I've seen a lot of new names popping up. So thank you for adding yourselves to the chat, and always nice to see a lot of the others that are here. I'm just scrolling through to see some of the names. There's Liz G. Nice to see you here in Norway, Zone 4. Is it okay to mulch my garlic with a thick layer of straw? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. My climate is inland climate, and we get in the mid-20s Celsius here. And so the mid-20s, that's about, I'm looking at my cheat sheet. That's at the mid-60s, around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But yeah, I've got videos on growing garlic, and that's what I use. I mulch my garlic with straw exclusively. Most of my beds I'll mix in grass clippings or crushed leaves, but for the garlic, it's pretty much 100% straw. And through the whole life, I put the cloves in. Next thing I do is mulch with straw. So you can check out my garlic growing. I've got a complete tutorial, complete guide on how to grow garlic, and that's what I show. after putting the cloves in, I'm mulching with a thick layer of straw. And thick is relative. So for me, it's at least 3 inches of straw is what I use. So you're looking at 7 to 8 centimeters as a minimum for the mulch that I use, because especially in Norway, like here in the mountains of Colorado, snow is going to weigh down that straw, and it's going to create a really nice insulation layer. And so when you start with a nice thick layer, it gives you enough after it begins to compact. And then in spring, I usually add more, depending on how much it's compacted and if it's begun to break down at all. That lower level sometimes will begin to decompose. And then in springtime, I'll add another couple inches. So straw with garlic, great match, great fit, and it's definitely something I would suggest you do. It's what I do, and it works. So there's a suggestion from one cold climate to another climate. The mulch can also help moderate the soil temperatures as well, so you don't have any issues with frost heave or with the cloves being too affected with bare soil. Bare soil, not a good thing anywhere in the garden. So it's been a nice Monday. I've enjoyed talking to you all, and thank you, Jason. A very easy man to talk to. You shouldn't be surprised. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's been a good week. We got some good chatting. Let's end here with a question from John Jude. So you say bone meal or blood meal should be added weeks before seedlings are seed? Oh yeah, absolutely. So blood meal and bone meal are great ways to get that phosphorus and that nitrogen into your soil, but they're made from blood and bone, and they need to decompose. That organic matter, the blood and the bone, needs to be broken down by the soil microbes to release those nutrients, and then it's available to the plants. So blood meal by itself has no nutritive value for plants. It's the blood that's been decomposed that releases the nitrogen. I'm not sure if it's nitrite or nitrate, but that's what becomes available to the plants from the blood, and that takes time for those microbes to break it down. And if you're just getting into organic gardening, and I've had this question from gardeners before, I added blood meal to my tomatoes, my peppers, whatever the plant might be, and I didn't see any difference. Well, yeah, because you're not going to see a difference. It's going to take weeks for that to break down and for those nutrients to become available, and then you'll see a difference. So that's why I say do it ahead of time, so that the plants will benefit from it, and the microbes will be happy, and their plants will be happy, and you'll be happy, and then we'll have something to talk about in these Monday live streams. And I'll be back next Monday to talk about gardening, a new subject matter, but of course, I'll always be answering your questions and enjoying your comments. Hope it's a great gardening week, even for those of us that have a change in the weather ahead. And for those of you who are also looking at weather changes, I hope it's a good weather change and you can still get outside and get those projects accomplished. Have a great gardening week, and I'll see you here next Monday. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.